Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Tania Saeed is an associate professor of sociology at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, LUMS, Pakistan. Her research focuses on comparative and international education, exploring questions around education in relation to securitization, citizenship, and social justice. She is the author of Islamophobia and Securitization, Religion and Ethnicity and the Female Voice, published in 2016, and the co-author of Youth and the National Narrative, Education, Terrorism, and the Security State in Pakistan. 2020 is the date of that publication. Her current research explores ideologies of exclusion within educational institutions, focusing on school curriculum, textbooks, and the pedagogy in government, low-fee, private, and refugee schools in Pakistan. Saeed has a DPhil in education from the University of Oxford, and she has a master's in gender development and globalization from the London School of Political Science. So let us all welcome Dr. Saeed to this virtual meeting.
Thank you. Thank you for first of all, thank you for the invitation. And Dr. Du, thank you for the kind introduction, and to the audience for coming this early for this talk. So I'm going to begin by hopefully sharing my screen, and it worked. Yes, I hope you can see that. What I'll do today is primarily look at Islamophobia in the context of the South Asian community in Britain, but more specifically draw on my work, my book in particular, that looked at the narratives of British Muslim women with the Pakistani heritage and overseas Pakistanis who were studying in universities in the UK. The reason for this is to basically use this opportunity to present actual lived experiences of young British Muslims who are with Pakistani heritage, Pakistanis who have in their day-to-day existence experienced Islamophobia and securitization, and what that means for their ideas on belonging, on being British, on being Pakistani, on being Muslim in a highly securitized context. So there will be, I will try to go through these, present actual narratives, and with those narratives, present an analysis of what's going on in relation to the South Asian identity, and in particular, the Muslim Pakistani identity in the context of the UK. Now, the book builds primarily on qualitative research that was undertaken now between 2010 and 2012, at a time when the unpack problem was at its peak. So Afghanistan, Pakistan was sort of, conflated as this area where you could see the emergence of terrorism. Pakistan was labeled as the hub of terrorism. And what you saw with, even in the UK government's counter-terrorism report in 2012, was that they found between 2001 and 2011, nearly 25% of what they call Islamist-related terrorism convictions were linked in one way or another to Pakistan. So this sort of background is important in locating the identity of the British Muslim and Pakistani in a securitized context of Britain. So within that, what I'll do today is essentially start with a definition of Islamophobia. There are contesting definitions of what Islamophobia is. Understand the idea of Islamophobia, how it's through the experiences of students, and then in locating the South Asian community and the Pakistani community, draw on narratives that are linked to Britishness, that are linked to religiosity, that are linked to the experiences of Muslim and Pakistani students in the university, linked to what some Pakistani students called Pakophobia, and we'll sort of talk about what that means when you look at the intersection between religion, ethnicity, in a securitized context, and then also look at narratives of resistance of young students, young British Pakistanis, young Pakistanis, sort of, seizing the discourse around their identities and reclaiming it through different sort of actions and different forms of resistance within the university and beyond. So that is what I'll hopefully achieve today in this 1 hour, fingers crossed, hopefully within the 1 hour. But just to also give you some background to the students I'll be talking about, to my participants, They were between the ages of 18 to 28 when they spoke to me. I contacted them through student societies and through Islamic student societies and through Pakistani student societies. And they were women who sort of reached out to me when I advertised for for the participants that I was looking for my research. So these are women who define themselves as Muslim. The religiosity is different in the sense that there are degrees of religiosity within my sample. There are women who wear the Niqab, the full face veil. There are women who wear the Hijab and the Jilbab, so it's the head scarf with a long gown. The women who wear the headscarf with, Western dress, so not the perfect phrase, but nonetheless Western dress and the headscarf. There are women who wear the shalwar kameez, the Pakistani South Asian dress, which is like a long tunic with loose trousers. And there are women also like me who are practicing Muslims but do not have any sort of visible signifiers of their religious identity in a way. So it is looking at those experiences, looking at a spectrum of religiosity through the experiences of my participants. I will say the reason why I chose university and the reason why we're talking about educational institutions is because within the security agenda, the counterterrorism agenda in the UK, educational institutions have increasingly been drawn into that agenda precisely because they are viewed as places that might lead to the radicalization of Muslim students, which is a highly contentious idea, but it is linked to to the discovery of certain individuals who were involved in acts of terrorism, who at some point or the other attended universities in the UK. The most disturbing example is of Umar Farooq Abdul Muttalib, who tried to hijack a plane in 2012. And he was not only a graduate of a university in London, but also an ex-president of its Islamic Student Society. So all these sort of links led to this idea that something was going on in educational institutions. The problem, as we'll see, is that this sort of surveillance led to all students looking a certain way, belonging to a certain identity, being considered suspect and hence constantly under surveillance, and has repercussions therefore for certain types of freedoms, not only in university campuses, but also beyond in public spaces as well. So you will be seeing that today. Just to give you a bit of the background of the demographics in South Asia. And this is according to the 211 census of England and Wales. Again, it's been a decade now, but these are the official figures and these numbers will have increased by now. But just to give you an idea, 2.7 million Muslims. The Muslim community is 4.8% of the population in England and Wales. The Muslim identity is of course diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, culture, sect, and tradition. And however, the majority is from South Asia, in particular from Pakistan and Bangladesh. But I will add that if taking the religious variable out, if you look at the South Asian population, the majority is from India, has links to India, and then you have Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then you have others, meaning Sri Lanka, Nepal, Myanmar. So you have a strong South Asian population within the UK. Before again going to the actual narratives and to Islamophobia itself, I would also like to give you a brief sort of overview, and I'm cognizant of the time. So just a brief overview of the South Asian community in the UK. In particular, the presence of the South Asian community, or rather the influx of communities from South Asia, started in the 1940s and 50s after the collapse of the British Empire. But it is very much the way it's located within the national imagination in Britain, which is something you can see not only in political rhetoric, but also in the media, is very much still linked to a colonial legacy. So colonialism is, when you're thinking about the South Asian community in the UK, it is very much linked to the colonies, the Indian subcontinent being an ex-colony of Britain, and then eventually the emergence of the Commonwealth after the British Empire collapsed, which sort of the Commonwealth emerged from these ex-colonies in order to facilitate trade, where of course Britain was still in control of the Commonwealth. So in the late 1940s, 1950s, you see this influx of South Asians, particularly Pakistanis and Bangladeshis who came into the UK to take on working class jobs in the factories, as was the demand at that time. And this sort of resulted eventually in the change within the demographics of the UK, which was largely a white population, which now saw the entry of these, colonial subjects into the colonial center, which, as can be expected, it resulted in obviously certain levels of racism, but also certain policies that at some level restricted future influx in terms of immigration laws, but also race relation acts, which sort of protected the rights of those citizens who had eventually entered the UK. So you see in the 1960s and 70s, sort of this, and because of the time limit, I won't give too much detail, but in the 1960s and 70s, you see, this sort of tension between immigrants coming in, and obviously this awareness of, certain rights of these immigrants who are now being granted the status of citizenship, albeit with some sort of, variations and some sort of, they're still within certain categories, but also this idea of this recognition within the population that the population demographics are changing, resulting in a tension between different communities. But it is in the 1980s that you see a political British Muslim identity being sort of, talked about, at least in the political discourse. Not to say that the Muslims were not politically active before that. They were active for, the right to have a place of worship. They were active for looking for halal food. They were active for their rights. But it was in the 1980s, after the Rushdie affair, that you really see a politicized British Muslim identity being at least acknowledged, if not recognized by the mainstream media and by the politicians in the UK. Now, just to give you briefly what the Rushdie affair was, Salman Rushdie published a book, The Satanic Verses, which was considered blasphemous, to the point that the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran issued a fatwa, a religious edict, against Rushdie. And at that point, a lot of British Muslims, especially Muslims, interestingly, from South Asia, sort of responded to that edict, and they protested against Salman Rushdie, expecting the British government to, at that time, to take actions against Rushdie for the blasphemous material that he had produced. And so at that point, and this is something which I think is important to highlight here, in the words of scholars Nasir Mir and Noorani, at that time, the British public became aware of, and I quote, the presence of minorities who not only subscribe to a national and regional identity, but also to a universal Muslim identity, which was reinforced by British Muslims themselves in their public demands. And after this, so when you see that tension between, at least not the tension for the community, the tension for the host society, to have a community population where you see sort of differences between the religious identity and what in the imagination of the white British population host community ought to be the British identity. There you also eventually see the emergence of a securitized identity in the aftermath of the tragedies of 9/11 and of 7/7 2005 in the UK. And that's where you see, and we'll look at the implications that had for the British Muslim community and also for the South Asian community in the UK. So just to give you that background in the way we sort of, before moving into the actual narratives and to how we understand Islamophobia. But that background is also important then in locating Islamophobia within the UK, because for Chris Allen, the way Islamophobia exists today is very much located to the 1980s, when you saw this distinct sort of British Muslim identity being recognized, and with it a distinct anti-Muslim prejudice also emerging. Etymologically, the term Islamophobia itself can be traced back to the 20th century in a French article, but the way it is understood today, the way it emerged in the UK, is something that you can trace back to the 1980s, according to, as established by Chris Allen in his work. Institutionally, though, it was in 1994 that you have the Runnymede Trust come up with the Runnymede report, Islamophobia Challenge for Us All, where it was defined as unfounded hostility towards Islam, the result of closed views about Islam. But this particular definition didn't really capture the kind of lived, the kind of discrimination that Muslims faced in their lived experiences. It was rather more seen as something that was more more looking at, you know, at points which were easy to quantify rather than the qualitative experiences of Muslims, which is why later on you see these definitions evolving, and we'll come to how it's being defined today as well in the UK. However, in also understanding Islamophobia, you need to contextualize it to the place of not just the South Asian community, of course, which we're talking about, but also of Muslims within the British imagination, which again is linked back to this ideological Orientalist struggle, which Saeed claims is at the heart of Islamophobia, the maintenance of the violent hierarchy between the idea of the West and all it's supposed to represent, the civilized sort of ideal of enlightenment, and Islam and all it's the way it's represented and stereotyped. So the idea of the barbaric, backward sort of, you know, Muslim ideal. And again, this in Saeed's work is linked back to stereotypes that emerged during the Crusades, which can be traced during the colonial sort of enterprises and the kind of exploitation that took place under colonialism, and eventually also to the kind of rhetoric you hear today in British media and in within what do you call it, political rhetoric as well. Yeah. So and this and tracing this, I think Saeed's, if anyone is interested, Saeed's interview with Eleanor Wachtel is really useful in the way he explains how European views of Islam in the 12th century and European views of Islam in the 18th and 19th century and the 20th centuries have really not changed that much. And I would argue that is also true for the 21st century in the way you see depictions of Muslims and the way Muslims are sort of stereotyped. Islamophobia is also understood as a form of racialization, which is again a definition that is contentious, and there are sort of, you know, opposition to this definition as well. Racialization meaning that racialized bodies were never exclusively biological. They were marked by religion, culture, history, and territories, were marked and used to group socially fabricated distinctions between Europeanness and non-Europeanness. And for Maudud, he traces this sort of racialization to a form of cultural racism as well, which again, going back to what I told you about the politicized Muslim identity in the 1980s, can also be traced back to the late 1980s, where ethnic or racial differences were also sort of, you know, emerged in the way in which communities were stereotyped, essentialized, and racialized. And this is important in sort of thinking of Islamophobia in relation to racialization when you think of the way even white Muslim identities are racialized. The fact that you essentialize the Muslim identity to the hijab, to the niqab, to sort of, you know, a particular way in which a beard, for instance, for a man, the way those identities are essentialized is where you see this form of racialization taking place, because that essentialist identity in essence is then linked to certain stereotypes of, you know, the dangerous Muslim, of the woman who is either both oppressed and ironically also a threat who needs to be rescued. So those are sort of the connections that you see in the way Islamophobia is defined as racialization. And with racialization, then you also have Islamophobia as securitization, which is defined in Stuart Croft's work, where Muslims are both the radical and the orientalized other. And the way the radical and the orientalized other is constructed is located within a history where the Muslim identity has been otherized, has been seen as the opposite to, you know, a civilized identity, the opposite to the enlightened identity, and where every aspect of a Muslim radical and the orientalized other, therefore, is securitized, is considered to be suspect. And you see this interestingly in what Donald Rumsfeld, in fact, and Jackson talks about this in his work, called the unknown unknown. The unpredictability of modern day terrorism means that you have a culture of surveillance, right? Because you don't know who the threat is in a way. The irony is you do know, in the sense that you have confined it and defined it to a particular community, the Muslim community, in the way that you are sort of securitizing them, and the way that they become suspicious, and the way they're under surveillance. So it's not completely an unknown unknown. It is a known unknown in the imagination of the security apparatus, right? The way that it works, because you have a certain an entire community, and a community which, I mean, majority of whom are innocent, being securitized and being kept under surveillance and being considered suspicious, and where these stereotypes lead to certain sort of encounters with Islamophobia and racism in different forms. And this is where you sort of see how Islamophobia securitization then emerges. And obviously the securitization is nonetheless also connected to counterterrorism policies. As I mentioned, the universities, educational institutions have increasingly become part of the security apparatus in the UK. But what has happened even more is how that has sort of curtailed the freedom of religious expression, the freedom of political expression for the Muslim community. And this has increased to other communities as well today. I mean, I'm talking about 2010 and 2012, but sort of the extent of the powers of, you know, the security state has moved way beyond just the Muslim student body, but that's another presentation, I suppose. But it's important at this stage to also mention how the Counterterrorism and Security Act of 2015, in fact, imposed a statutory duty on universities to report on any student they found to be suspicious, right? So if they don't, it is considered, there is a fine, and it is considered a crime then, yeah? So you've reached a point where you have to report on students, which basically is a problem, because you also don't know what exactly is someone who is, you know, who is suspicious, what that suspicion means. Is it a young person who discovers religion and, you know, becomes religious all of a sudden? And again, no one ever becomes religious all of a sudden, but for you, who's seeing this person feels, oh, but all of this is suspicious. Why are they wearing what they're wearing? Why are they dressed the way they're dressed? Why are they looking the way they're looking? So all of those aspects go into the way you sort of see how the security apparatus, and how sort of this idea of, you know, who is suspicious, how that suspicion is understood, is defined, goes into creating sort of, you know, making confining sort of the kind of freedoms that students have within the university. So that is where this becomes important in the kind of statutory duties that are being imposed. And as an example, briefly, I will mention, and you can easily look this up, there are multiple examples. There have been cases of students who were reported for reading a book on terrorism, which ended up being part of their course, but because they were a Muslim student, they were reported for that. Even before the Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015, students had been reported. A PhD student, for instance, was reported for downloading the Al-Qaeda manual, which he had downloaded for his PhD. Even after his advisor, his supervisor, spoke to the authorities, he was still arrested and kept for 7 to 10 days for sort of downloading and questioning, because he was considered suspicious. So you have these examples of students in the way in which Muslim students are under surveillance and are considered suspect. There is still debate over definitions, and the all-party parliamentary group, which is an independent group of parliamentarians across the aisle. They formed this group on British Muslims, and they came up with the definition in which they define Islamophobia as rooted in racism, and a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. However, this particular definition is something that has been opposed by the Federation of Student Islamic Society, FOSIS, which is this umbrella group of for Islamic societies across England and Wales. And for them, such a definition undermines how Islamophobia is a form of religious discrimination that essentially targets Muslims and their religion. So the reason for sort of bringing in these different definitions, racialization, securitization, it's a form of racism, it's just about religious discrimination, is to give you an idea of how the debate continues. But the experiences of Islamophobia nonetheless still exist, and it has increased with time, especially after the Brexit vote and the anti-immigrant sentiment that you see in the UK. Now, sort of in my own work, I define Islamophobia drawing more on the racialization and securitization aspect of it as a socio-psychological process. And what this means is that it can take different forms, and it can be internalized in different ways, as the narratives in my work will show. It can obviously take direct forms of verbal, physical discrimination. It can be direct through certain laws and regulations, especially within universities, but it can also be indirect in the way sort of, the way the community is under surveillance, the way that suspicion is internalized by students themselves, to the point that it leads to self-censorship, to the point that students themselves have to be careful, avoid certain political events, avoid certain statements out of fear of being labeled radical, and hence report it to the authorities. So that is where that social psychological sort of process becomes important in understanding. And such layers of experiences of discrimination and experiences in particular of Islamophobia can only be, in my opinion, understood and can only sort of come forward when you have an in-depth qualitative study that looks at it, that examines it in detail, which you see through these narratives. So what you see in Islamophobia as a lived experience is, how young people are experiencing Islamophobia, but also how they are informed through media narratives as well. I mentioned this in the definition while exploring Islamophobia and how Muslims are represented. But there are definitely negative sort of perceptions of Muslims in the media, at times inaccurate and sensationalist reporting. And I'll just give you one example of this, which is this picture that was taken after the Westminster attack in London in 2017, where you see this young woman who was crossing the bridge. And in most sort of tabloid press, in the media, even in certain among certain politicians, this picture was seen as a Muslim woman who does not really care about what's going on around her. She's clearly distressed. That's how when I saw the picture, I thought it was someone who was distressed. But in the way sort of this, and you can also look it up online, the way this woman was presented within sort of media and tabloid press, is this woman who's just on her phone, does not care about what's going on around her. There were certain sort of statements comparing how, had this been a Christian woman as opposed to a Muslim woman, the reaction would have been different. She would have been more concerned, etc. Not sort of realizing that the next sort of picture, which they did not show, is someone who is clearly distressed. And the lady herself sort of shares, she gave an interview after this image went viral, of how she had actually stopped and she was helping, and then she got up and she was clearly visibly stressed. But the point is not whether she was or wasn't. The point is how, a visibly Muslim woman is presented as someone who is always going to be outside, as someone who is always going to be, insensitive to the reality of the UK itself, as someone who clearly lacks, the kind of loyalty or commitment that should exist within how they would define a British citizen. And we'll come to how they define what then Britishness really is. But before getting to that, then Islamophobia for the young women I spoke to is something that is very much, again, linked to these sort of stereotypes, right? Again, linked to certain types of images that in essence define their lived reality, that sort of shape their experiences. And for Sabahat, one of my participants, is a young teacher who in the beginning did not used to wear the hijab, but after a certain time, in fact, when I met her, just a year before I met her, she started wearing the headscarf, and she sort of shared experiences of how parents' attitude towards her as a teacher changed, how colleagues' attitudes towards her as a teacher changed after she started being more sort of, more visible about her Muslim identity. But for her, clearly, Islamophobia is this idea of, the fear of the unknown, the fact that of the unknown but known unknown, the fact that any Muslim can at any given point in time turn into a terrorist or do something wrong on public transport or kill people. So it is and this is sort of again the image of this a Muslim who can't be trusted, the image of that woman who clearly has no care for a fellow citizen, the idea of how these images are informing certain experiences, are informing certain lived realities of young Muslim women. Islamophobia is also seen as psychological discrimination against Muslims, according to Salma, people having reservations about Muslims. And it's interesting, again, as I mentioned, because the young women I spoke to over the 2-year period were women who practiced different degrees of religiosity. So not everyone sort of wore the hijab or the niqab. They had different ways of expressing their Muslimness. But nonetheless, they did feel that that Islamophobia was very much sort of this idea of having certain reservations against Muslims, and on the basis of that sort of having certain attitudes about Muslims. And it's interesting how Muslims themselves, this is an important point to remember, which I feel in the discussion on Islamophobia often is not discussed, how Muslims themselves can also be Islamophobic when it comes to these degrees of religiosity. And as an example, I will share Fatma's narrative, and she herself sort of came to this realization during our discussions, how even for these images have also informed her sort of attitude towards women who, for instance, wear the niqab, so the full face veil, or wear a certain gown with it, that she would avoid them, that she would she didn't want other people to associate her with them, even though she is a practicing Muslim herself. So the way this sort of comes out at different points is important to unpack in these experiences, even within sort of the British Muslim community, and I've said Muslim community on larger scale, but also how within the South Asian Pakistani community, how you see different expressions of religiosity and what is accepted and what is not accepted. Because for some of the women I spoke to who did not wear, for instance, the niqab in particular, they believed that the niqab had nothing to do with Islam, and especially nothing to do with their particular sort of idea of Islam. And there were these, again, within that small sort of the 40 or so participants, there were these tensions in the way these expressions of religiosity came forward. And in the end, I think it's important also to see what Islamophobia does, right? This is where Faiza's interview becomes important, and later on Faiza's narrative will come up again when we talk about what happens in the university. But Faiza, as a young British Muslim woman with a Pakistani heritage, wore the niqab. So she was quite prominently Muslim. And she believed that having experienced Islamophobia, she did not complain, because she felt that as a minority, this was something that you had to deal with. And that was just the nature of being a minority in a non-Muslim context. And that becomes also important in the way, again, the way surveillance works, the way you're sort of told where you belong as a minority community in a context where you are under suspicion just for believing in a certain sort of having a certain faith or having a certain religious belief. So again, these narratives and the ways, when you talk about social psychological, the way they are internalized by at times Muslims themselves, the way certain expressions of Muslimness is sort of triggers certain responses, and the way, again, media narratives and political rhetoric plays an important role in reinforcing these stereotypes for the Muslim community. And we also then, this sort of brings us to this then idea of, well, then what is Britishness, right? If you are a minority, what does it mean to be British in a context where that is your identity? And Tehmina's narrative becomes really important in this. So Tehmina at that point a very politically active member of the National Student Union in her university, and in fact she also participated in different sort of youth political groups outside her community around around youth rights. And for her, this idea of being called a minority is something she never agreed with, because for her, just because she's not white doesn't make her any less British. So these categories become important in the way they identify certain groups. Serena Hussain, for instance, in her work on the census in Britain and the kind of categories that emerge in the way, different states try to organize and try to sort of manage their communities, talks about how certain minority status and certain categories end up being more limiting and end up being more divisive in the way they, certain sort of communities are labeled as being different, right? And it's interesting because the minority status at the same level can give you rights, because that means you are protected as a minority, but that can also mean that you are not accepted as part of the majority, because a minority would in essence mean that there is in opposition a majority that exists, that is seen as what it means to be British, as someone who is fully British. And I will also add here that there were also narratives of how what we define, and we often come across these terms as second generation or third generation. So Tamina, for instance, in her conversation mentioned how she never understood when one stops becoming second, third, fourth, and when one is just accepted as being British. So you're always second generation British Pakistani, third generation, where in fact, for someone who has only, whose reality is only informed by their British experience, while being South Asian, while being Pakistani, while being Muslim, while being a woman, while having all these different identities, nonetheless, you see sort of how you are still constantly being reminded that you're second and third generation. And also in relation to this, I think Farzana's narrative, and I just saw there's a question on whiteness as well. Farzana's narrative also sort of speaks to that question, how she talks about how she is, and Farzana, a British Muslim who did not wear any of visible sort of identifiers. She was a practicing Muslim, but she did not wear a hijab or anything that would make her stand out in a stereotypical way as a Muslim. And for her, she sort of talked about how, if someone who is white asked her if she was British, she herself would feel kind of stupid saying that to a white person, because often this sort of, this question of are you British or where are you from is often sort of asked to certain communities. And this again came up in the narratives that the participants shared, to communities who are non-white, right? So you're asked, where are you from? And for instance, Farzana shared this example of how she was from Birmingham. And then, the same person asked, but where are you really from? And that really from is quite a loaded sort of question. It can be an innocent question. There may not be malice behind it, but nonetheless, it sort of shows the kind of, in essence, epistemic violence that exists through sort of images and through the kind of knowledge that exists about certain communities, which sort of lead to such questions being asked of communities that may not be considered white, because white is very much considered what it means to be British or what it means to be English. And English and Britishness, that's again another sort of category, and we won't go into that because we don't have enough time for it. But nonetheless, these sort of definitions come in. Then you also have this idea of, as I mentioned, of which boxes one fits into. So Kiran, for instance, has never understood the question of being British or being Muslim or being Pakistani, because for her, she's all things at the same time. She is a mother herself, a mother who has a full-time job, who has a part-time job, a mother who's also studying. So for her, these categories, when such questions are asked and when such sort of differences are raised in media, in the kind of policy reports, in the kind of political rhetoric that she's heard in Britain, it makes no sense to her, because for her, all these things are equally important. When she says that we all have these different identities at the same time, If someone was to ask about being Muslim and Christian, that is different. But I can be Pakistani, British, and Muslim at the same time. And I find it really easy to be all. And at times, being a mother, being a working mother, being a student at the same time, I feel like I am a superwoman. A woman who, and Kiran again, a woman who wears the hijab and the jilbab, a very strong Muslim woman who believed that she could be all three things at the same time, but is often in all of these narratives, the Muslim women who I spoke to, and again, there is diversity in those narratives, were more comfortable in sort of balancing these different identities, but often the unease came from a host community that couldn't understand how to locate them, because in the imagination of the host community, the idea of what Britishness means, of being British, is a certain identity where you don't have sort of religion, especially a religion like Islam, central to it, where you don't have a particular different culture, as opposed to a very sort of British, to an extent, also English culture that should inform the identities of these particular communities. Yeah. Okay. So you have again these different narratives in relation to Britishness and to being a Pakistani, being a Muslim, all of these narratives sort of playing into how these young women have to negotiate, or rather are seen as women who are negotiating these different identities, when in fact there is obviously a balancing act, but nonetheless that balancing act is not one where they're struggling to sort of express or understand who they really are. With this comes then the degree of religiosity. Again, the fact that someone is wearing a niqab, hijab, someone is wearing a shalwar kameez, or an ethnic South Asian dress, and what that means. And what I found in my work, in the way I sort of looked at these narratives, was this idea of a vulnerable fanatic that oxymoronically exists, right? It's this woman who is, again, oppressed in the imagination of the host community, and who's oppressed in the imagination of media, who needs to be saved from this barbaric repressive religion because she's hidden, she doesn't have rights in their mind. And then also this woman who is a threat at the same time, right? Because she's hidden. You don't know who is hiding. She's hiding in plain sight. So the vulnerable fanatic, in essence, is how you see, and how I've defined sort of, the British Muslim identity, female identity in particular, in relation to a securitized context. And you see this especially, and again, this was not much of a revelation because I was expecting this. You see the most sort of extreme form of Islamophobia being faced by women who wear the niqab. But what's interesting is also the different types of Islamophobic encounters that women who wear the hijab, and also women who are not visibly stereotypically Muslim, sort of the kind of experiences they encounter. So for example, for Nadia, who normally wears the hijab and a long gown, when she wore the niqab for the first time, she sort of encountered the worst type of Islamophobia, where she encountered this white man who was screaming at her saying, "Oh, you want us to be scared of you, don't you? Want us to be scared of you?" And that sort of and she sort of goes on to explain how this idea of seeing someone, and seeing in particular a young woman who the assumption is a young woman, but who goes against what is considered normal in that particular context, is something that is not only physically, it does not only scare someone physically out, and this idea of being afraid of what's hidden, but also ideologically it has implication. So in essence, you see that a woman who's wearing the niqab ideologically challenge, and sort of in a way challenge this enlightened landscape that exists within the imagination of the British public. So, and you're disrupting that in particular. And I think the FOSIS representative, as I mentioned, FOSIS is the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, the umbrella group of all Islamic student societies across England and Wales. So a FOSIS representative talking about this, sort of explained how being visually Muslim means that all the issues around terrorism, around sort of, and all the stereotypes of how women are oppressed, all of that are sort of are personified in that one veiled figure, especially one niqabi figure who's completely covered. And you see, at least in the research that I've seen, and also in the studies, for instance, you see in the work of Saria Contractor, who has also looked at gendered Muslim identities, the niqab is seen as the most problematic in relation to the kind of Islamophobic encounters women have experienced. Then you also have within the university the kind of experiences that young women have faced. This is just one example of Faiza. Faiza, if you remember, is the same student who initially said, you're a minority, you have to deal with it. So Faiza, very particular about her niqab, was told before an exam in a room full of around 200 students to remove her niqab for identification. And normally what happens in these exams, even if it's a man, is that you're asked to move to one side. And normally there is a woman who, checks for you. But this time there was a man who refused to move and who told her to do that before her exam. And again, in this case, it's important also to mention that the students around her told her to complain, because they felt that this was, uncalled for, and this was clearly Islamophobic, clearly racist in the way and unprofessional in the way the invigilator behaved, and it was really disturbing for her before that exam. But what was interesting is also what she found even more disturbing was the way in which the student, she was sitting, mind you, for an English exam, and the student before the exam was spoken to in a patronizing way as if she didn't understand English. And and that, again, this is a British Muslim young woman who born in Britain, lived all her life in Britain, speaks fluent English, being treated as someone who is a foreigner, or someone who's slow and unable, and the way sort of the patronizing manner in which Faiza explained, the invigilator spoke to her was almost thinking that she doesn't understand because here is a woman who's in a niqab. So again, the levels in which you see, Islamophobia manifest itself, or certain stereotypes come out in different ways in sort of these experiences of young women who wear the niqab. With the hijab, it's the narratives that I came across were quite interesting in the way in which women, again, and problematic, of course, in the way women experienced Islamophobia, but also the terms that were used, as insults against them. So Mehreen's example is one where she wears the hijab, not the niqab, and she sort of saw how in one of her experiences she was followed by these two students who tried to stop her. One eventually even spat at her. She crossed before anything could happen, and she could hear him, and she could hear other people also at times call her a lesbian. Now again, lesbian is not an insult, but the way it's used is an insult in a context where there is a particular heteronormative sort of, discourse around sexuality and around female sexuality in particular. She goes on to explain how the fact that she's Muslim and the fact that she is clearly a practicing Muslim wearing the hijab, the assumption is, of course, that she will not, she does not have a sex outside of marriage. So there is this, and that she goes to gatherings which are only female. So again, certain sort of terms are being used, in certain ways she's being stereotyped as far as her female identity is concerned, which I felt was more sort of, it's an interesting sort of term to use as an insult in a context where clearly you have certain ideals of what female sexuality ought to be, particularly in that context. And then you have those young women who don't have these signifiers, so they don't meet the stereotype of a Muslim woman who should be covered or should look a certain way. And I think Aisha's narrative is really interesting in this context, where she talks about how they'll say, oh, why don't you drink? And it will turn into a big thing. Why don't you wear a headscarf? If you don't drink, why don't you have sex before marriage? People need an excuse. A lot of young British Muslims nowadays, especially in universities, are getting integrated. We are brought up in a way that, people don't like it when we can do both, we can be westernized in a way and still have a culture intact. And that is when, sort of, when you don't fit the stereotype, that is when they really try to psychoanalyze you. So again, sort of the experiences are so different, while at the same time are similar in the way certain ideals of being female are being reflected in the ways, you know, young women experience Islamophobia, and the way these sort of stereotypes exist within the host community, and in particular within the young people who clearly the Islamophobes' imagination as well. Finally, what you have, so while you're looking at, you know, these ideas of Britishness, the experiences of religiosity, and how the experiences of Islamophobia vary across different degrees of religiosity, what you also then come to bringing it directly to the university are Islamic student societies. So ISocs it's basically short for Islamic student societies. And in particular, sort of my work focused more on the female wing of the Islamic student society, the Soc Sisters. If you remember in the beginning, I mentioned the case of Umar Farooq Abdul Muttalib, who was a young man who was associated not only with the university, he had graduated from university, but was also the president of the Islamic Student Society at the time when he was a student. And later, he became a terrorist. He tried to hijack a plane, and it was so these Islamic student societies were already, I mean, especially in the aftermath of, you know, the July the 7/7 attacks were under surveillance. But after 2012, the kind of surveillance and suspicion on these student societies, Islamic student societies, grew to quite an extent. And you see, not just in the way that they were under surveillance and the way their events were often at times cancelled, the way there was extra security often around their events, which was never the case for a lot of other student societies and their events, but also the kind of, you know, stereotypes and the kind of ideas other students had about these student societies, and how that impacted their experiences of being an Islamic, either a member of the Islamic student society, or even in the way they try to promote certain ISoc events. So, for instance, Fatma came across quite a few people who were Islamophobic type of people when we had events, who used to, you know, pass remarks such as, "Oh, these stalls, they're recruiting terrorists." They often the response from, you know, the ISoc members was something where they tried not to respond, not to react, because that would feed into the stereotype. You would also see students feeling they felt like you know, they were being singled out again, and what was interesting is also in relation to the kind of political activism that you saw. So for instance, in one case, an Islamic society invited a particular speaker to speak about Palestine, and it was again it was at that particular point they were not informed that there would be extra security, and before the event, literally before the event began, you had extra security checking Muslim students, checking their bags for a student event where no such form of, you know, security or any such form of sort of suspicion had existed for any other student event. And this was, and again, Rumina's sort of narrative was not unique. I came across quite a few examples where at times, for instance, as Nargis mentions, you couldn't, you know, you, what do you call it? You needed Islamic student societies because they were important for student welfare. Sort of, they provided a home for Muslim students, but at the same time, there were students, and even Nargis mentioned initially that there were students who were hesitant in joining ISocs precisely because they thought if anything happened, you know, these student societies would come under suspicion the most. And I think what you saw in particular, I'm also conscious of the time, so I'm going to skip through some of these. What you also saw in the example of Hafsa, for instance, is that her mother, for example, told her not to get involved in the Islamic society, because when she says pehle koi masla hota hai to inke piche aate, meaning whenever there is a problem, the first ones they come after are these people. This is, so even parents were sort of, discouraging their own students from joining these student societies. And it's interesting because I also spoke to another student who mentioned how before the events of 2012, the parents were, in fact, Nadia, the head sister of an Islamic society in her university, mentioned how before the events of 2012, when that student was arrested, parents actually wanted their children to join an Islamic society, thinking they will stay on the straight and narrow path. But after that, they were afraid for their children in case they would come under suspicion, under surveillance. So discouraging them from joining that. Again, aware of the time, I think I have 10 minutes since we started late, if I'm not mistaken. So I will move on to Islamophobia as Pakphobia. So that's where your Pakistani identity comes in, and the reason why, for instance, I focused on on Pakistani students and the Pakistani ethnic identity in relation to religion. What I found at a point where a lot of the sort of rhetoric around terrorism brought in not just the Muslim identity, but also the Pakistani identity. Again, Pakistan was in the news, was presented as being this hub of terrorism. And by the time, like when I was finishing up my interviews, that was the year when when Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan. So the image of Pakistan was seen as this country where which was harboring terrorism or was supporting terrorism in some way. And what happened as a result of that was that you also saw Pakistani students being targeted for their Pakistani identity. And Salma, for instance, sort of captures this when she talks about how we are Pakistani, so we have that situation of having different types of stereotypes and negative perceptions associated with us because Pakistan is not popular. As a Pakistani Muslim, it is quite difficult to sometimes see whether it is religious resentment or cultural resentment. Both are not seen as the best possible scenarios. And this particularly came out with young women who did not have any religious signifiers, right? So their identity as a Pakistani woman, especially if they were wearing Pakistani, so South Asian, shalwar kameez, it often stood out, where the Pakistani Muslim connection further added to the kind of racist slurs, for instance, that they came across, the way that they were called certain names. So Abda, for instance, shared a narrative, I don't have it here, but she shared a narrative where she was called a third world assassin when someone overheard her and thought that she was Pakistani. And she believed that there was a form of Pakophobia, which, as she describes it, is a form of Islamophobia. But what you do find is that if you're Pakistani, then the kind of hatred and the kind of sort of vitriol that is thrown at you is of another level, right? So she gave the example of, for instance, Muslims coming from Dubai or Muslims coming from the UAE, where the attitude that she felt of people towards them was very different from those people who were coming from Pakistan. And you see this also in a form of self-censorship. So, for instance, Mariam, who came from Pakistan as a student, was told by her own aunt not to tell people that she was Pakistani, instead go around telling them that she's Indian, because of the fact that after the 7/7 tragedy and what was going on in the country, Pakistanis were not seen in the best possible light. So it was better to tell people that they were of a different identity, of a different nationality. And you did see the self-censorship also in the kind of political activism that you saw young Pakistanis taking on. Amna, for instance, was very politically active, especially about Pakistan, about drone attacks in Pakistan, about the dictatorship at that time in Pakistan. So she tried to gather support for it. And what she saw was that people were more active for, Pakistanis were more active for Palestine than they were for Pakistan, because Palestine was seen for them as a Muslim issue. Pakistan was seen as more problematic, as a political issue. So despite being Pakistanis themselves. So again, the kind of self-censorship that comes with certain sort of, causes. Of course, given where we are today, this may not be completely true, because the kind of censorship you're seeing in universities in the UK is of a different level. So these sort of issues have also evolved. Finally, when we come to reclaiming the narrative, I'll take three more. I think, do I have 5 minutes? I'm guessing, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so if we're coming to reclaiming the narrative, what you do see are Muslims, are students, talking about how the idea of being acceptable is related to being to trying to appear more normal to people. And again, this idea of what is normal against what is considered abnormal, who defines what that normality is very much again linked to how within a university, for instance, the forces representative told students to get involved in events outside the Islamic student society, try to appear more normal, try to sort of let people know that you are like them, you're not completely different, right? And this is something, and you see young students in their conversations trying to do different things on campus to make sure that they can build relationships. So for instance, Nadia in her work believed that if people had certain prejudices, you had to make an extra effort to speak to them. You had to make an extra effort to let them know that you are different, because a lot of this, of the kind of Islamophobia that she felt was in the university was the result of certain stereotypes, but also the result of stereotypes that existed because you didn't see sort of, you didn't see people meeting each other, you didn't see people, you didn't see students meeting other Muslims. So you had this duty, you had to take the initiative of trying to change mindsets there. And Nasia, for instance, she encountered certain stereotypes about Pakistanis, so she made the effort of making sure that she would, even when she didn't feel like going out, she would hang out with friends, she would go to parties, and just to sort of also show her friends that being a Muslim, being a female, being a Pakistani is, is being as normal as someone else's, despite having these different sort of beliefs and these different ways of, different beliefs. So again, I will say this, in all of this, by no means am I implying, and by no means, at least the narratives, there's the implication that the onus of proving that you're normal should be on the students or should be on the Muslims, right? That should not be the case. But what you do see nonetheless are young people sort of taking that initiative and, and sort of trying to change at least the sort of discrimination, prejudices, and Islamophobia that exists around them when they can. And this is, again, you see this idea, this recognition coming from a male Muslim student who I met in London, who was the student union anti-racism officer, who believed that you had to take this initiative and you had to go beyond the university, and you had to engage with media, and you had to engage with politicians in order to change Islamophobia and the way that it existed within the UK. And Temina, again, was someone who believed that you needed to take the lead, because other people for too long had been sort of, deciding what it meant to be Muslim, had been defining the Muslim identity, and had been defining the place of the Muslim community instead of young Muslims themselves. And I would like to mention for both Ahmed and Temina that they did go on to join local level politics after they graduated from their universities. So again, you see sort of people taking these initiatives. Towards the end, I did want to sort of extend this to, this is again not part of the work I do, but just to give you a sense of how Islamophobia works Also to give you an idea of how it's not just Muslims who have suffered Islamophobia. It's something I don't look at in my work. And there is, of course, layers of more analysis that should be undertaken around class, around race. I'm just looking at one particular ethnic identity. But you also see non-Muslims being targeted because of the stereotype that exists. So for instance, Imran Awan and Irene Zempi's work looks at how the Sikh community has been targeted. Katie Sian's work is also looking at the Sikh community. Awan and Zempi also look at how atheists, because they appear a certain way, are targeted for being Muslim. So you see how, while my work is looking at the Pakistani community, you also see this form of Islamophobia, this form of questioning of different identities happening in across other South Asian identities as well. So I'm guessing I'm out of time, so I will end here, but just to give you in the end an overview of what we've discussed, and the idea in the end that when the implications of, or rather of this research, in sort of, for those of you who might be thinking of doing such research in the audience, how there are also pockets when we're looking at this question. Within the young population, there are pockets of dialogue and resistance that already exist in universities. And I think in sort of understanding these issues, it's important to highlight how young people are actively trying to, reclaim that narrative, are actively trying to resist certain stereotypes about their identities. I will stop here if I'm not mistaken. I'm out of time.